The Stone of Scone. You know that the English sovereign is monarch of what is called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and that when we say Great Britain, we mean the three countries of England, Wales and Scotland. For a little more than 300 years the people of England and Scotland have been ruled by the same king, and as we all know, this has been a good thing for both peoples in many ways. But for hundreds of years before the King of Scotland inherited the throne of England, there was one king in England and another in Scotland. The two nations were enemies, and often there was war between them. Besides the big wars waged by large armies on each side, there were constant raids across the border. Small parties of the Scotch crossed into England, and small parties of English crossed into Scotland, plundering villages, destroying crops, carrying off cattle, burning farms, and doing all the harm they could. So the people on both sides of the border lived in constant fear and danger. And sometimes the Scotch, who were afraid of the English because they were much richer and more powerful, took sides with the French when they were at war with England. So one of the greatest of all the English kings, Edward I, a very wise man and a soldier who had once gone on a crusade to the Holy Land, thought that if he could conquer the people of Scotland, they could not help the French any more, and that once conquered, they would live quietly side by side with the English, and there would be peace in Great Britain. This is the story of how Edward tried to make himself master of Scotland, and of the brave way in which the Scotch defended themselves against him and all the power of England. There had been a time when the kings of Scotland did homage to the King of England, but Richard of the Lionheart sold his overlordship for money to carry on a crusade. But now when Edward I had been King of England for some years, King Alexander, the brave and beloved King of Scotland, died of an accident, and Scotland fell into grievous trouble. For Alexander left only a little granddaughter, and at first Edward thought to wed her to his own young son, but the princess died. Then uprose 12 Scotch nobles, each of whom claimed the Scottish throne, and as no one of them was strong enough to conquer the others, they agreed that King Edward, with the help of his wise men, should decide between them. So they recognised Edward as their overlord, and Edward chose John Balliol as their king. Edward tried to make the new king do everything he wished. This the Scotch bitterly resented, and they forced Balliol to refuse to help Edward against the French. So angry was Edward that he led a large army into Scotland and attacked the town of Berwick. Brave was the defence of the town, but Edward himself, on his horse Bayard, led his soldiers to the attack. The town was taken, and many of the inhabitants, men, women and children, were put to death. King Balliol, who up till then had wanted to keep on good terms with the English king, could restrain himself no longer. He declared war, but after cruel fighting and terrible ravages on both sides of the border, the Scotch were defeated in a great battle at Dunbar. King Balliol yielded himself up to King Edward, and deprived of his crown, he was made to stand as a penitent with a white rod in his hand, and to say that he had been a rebel and was justly punished. Then he was sent to England as a prisoner, but he was not harshly treated, and lived there peacefully for the remainder of his days. Now the kings of Scotland had for about 150 years been crowned at a place called Scone, near the east coast of Scotland, where there was a great monastery. There they were crowned sitting on a block of sandstone, which tradition said had once been used as a pillow in his monastery, on the little island of Iona, by St. Columba, who centuries before had come with other monks from Ireland and had taught the wild Scots to be Christians. And another tradition even said that this was the very stone which, as the Bible tells, Jacob used as a pillow the night he dreamt of angels descending and descending a ladder which reached from heaven to earth. Therefore to the Scots this was a sacred stone, and the sign of royal power, and besides there was a prophecy, which many of the Scots believed, which said that wherever the stone of Scone might be, there would the King of Scotland hold sway. So now, to show them he was really their master, Edward brought the stone in triumph to England. It was placed in the great abbey at Westminster, where you can still see it underneath the throne on which our kings are crowned. But the Scots were not discouraged. They resented the English rule, and soon they found a leader in a knight named William Wallace. Wallace was an outlaw living in the hills because, when very young, he had in a rage killed an English soldier who tried to take some fish which he had caught. In the wild hills and woods he had gathered together a large body of men, outlaws and haters of the English like himself, and now he attacked the English openly, and many of the Scotch nobles came to support him. King Edward's lieutenants collected a great army, and when they met Wallace and found his forces were also strong, they offered to make terms. "Return to your friends," said Wallace to the messengers. "Tell them we come with no peaceful intent, but determined to avenge ourselves and set our country free. Let them come and attack us. We are ready to meet them beard to beard." So a fierce battle took place, and the English were utterly defeated. Then Wallace invaded England and did terrible damage, plundering everywhere till the cold winter drove him back. He was a harsh and cruel man, but when his men, coming to a little chapel, rushed in, attacked the English priests and tried to take their robes and the ornaments off the altar, Wallace protected the priests and had the offenders put to death. Then King Edward himself led a mighty army into Scotland and met Wallace at Falkirk. Though 2 of his ribs were broken by his horse treading on him as he lay asleep, Edward still placed himself at the head of his troops, and though the Scots fought with great courage, they were beaten and Wallace was compelled to flee. Everywhere King Edward was slowly but surely victorious. In Stirling Castle alone a small body of the Scotch made a long and gallant defence, until they were almost starved to death. During his attacks on the walls of the castle, King Edward himself had several narrow escapes from death, and when at last the defenders could hold out no longer, and capitulated, Edward was so pleased with their courage that he received them into his favour and sent them in comfort to England. Soon after, the brave Wallace was betrayed by a false friend. Taken prisoner, he was brought to London and put to death as a traitor. His head, according to the bad custom of those hard times, was placed over one of the gates of old London Bridge. But the Scotch, though defeated for a time, were not dismayed, and a new and abler leader soon appeared. This was the famous Robert Bruce, whose grandfather had claimed the throne when King Alexander died. As a young man he had sided sometimes with King Edward, sometimes against him. Now he made up his mind to take up the cause of his countrymen. He raised an army and attacked the men whom King Edward had left to govern Scotland, and then he went to Scone. The sacred stone was in England, so were the royal crown and robes, but a little circlet of gold, borrowed from a goldsmith, and a bishop lent some robes, and a little band of nobles and their followers crowned him King of Scotland. When the news reached Edward, his rage was terrible. All his efforts, all the fighting seemed in vain. He had to begin to conquer Scotland over again. He prepared for war, and first he held a solemn festival in London. His son, also named Edward, and 300 young men had their tents set up around the Temple Church, which you can still visit, and all these youths, robed in white and scarlet, watched their arms throughout the night, and next morning were admitted to the order of knighthood by the king. Afterwards there was a great banquet, and in the midst 2 swans, representing constancy and truth, were brought to King Edward in a net of gold, and with his hands on them he vowed that never would he sleep 2 nights in the same place till he had conquered the Scots. And he made his son promise that if he died during the war, his body should be left above ground until the English were victorious. Then the army marched away to Scotland, with the king leading it, but it went slowly, for Edward was now old and ill. Everywhere the English wrought great destruction to the Scotch, and Edward showed himself cruel and revengeful in his anger. But King Robert Bruce would not meet the English armies. For a time he with his queen and little court lived among the hills in huts built of trees, with beds of skins, and getting their food by hunting and fishing. When winter came they made their way through the very midst of some of their Scottish enemies, for the Scotch were not yet all united, with great peril and some fighting, to various places of safety, and Bruce himself went to the islands by the west coast of Scotland. Some of his most faithful companions and 2 of his brothers were captured by King Edward's men, and those who were not put to death were very cruelly punished. But Bruce himself they could not find, and the news of the ill fortune of his friends only made him more resolute to carry on the war. Often he was brought nearly to despair. His life was in constant danger. He was once hunted by bloodhounds, but he escaped every peril as if by a miracle, and gradually he gathered together enough men to attack and defeat one of the English armies. And now the tide of fortune turned. King Edward was very ill and weary, and the news that Bruce was again at the head of a victorious army hastened his death. He died near the border, and for a while the struggle ceased. His son Edward II tried at the beginning of his reign to keep the vow which he had made to his father, but he was weak, irresolute, and no soldier. He quarrelled with his nobles and governed England very badly. So the power of England became less and less, and the strength of Bruce grew greater and greater, until at last the English and Scotch armies met, and the English suffered a crushing defeat. So Scotland won her independence back again, and Wallace, who began the long struggle, and Bruce, who brought it to an end in triumph, have rightly become the national heroes of the Scotch. The great King Edward, who though he had treated Scotland harshly had done mighty things for England, was buried in Westminster Abbey. His tomb is above the ground, for only in this way did his son keep the vow, in an ancient chapel. To this day you may see it and read the inscription: Edwarus primus malleus Grottorum pactum serva, which means, Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, keep faith. Nearby is the Stone of Scone, in the royal throne of the United Kingdom. Though defeated, the English kept the stone, and the old prophecy was at last fulfilled, but in a way King Edward never dreamed. For nearly 300 years after Edward's death, a Scottish king, James I, came to London to be crowned upon the stone King of England. And so the union of the English and Scotch people, which Edward had tried to bring about by war, was at last made in peace.